Julian Barrett had never imagined that the quiet edge of a well-organized suburban neighborhood could one day become a battleground, not of fists or bullets, but of wires, permits, and the quiet erosion of individual rights beneath layers of policy. Paper. For 5 years, he had lived at the southern end of Winslow Ridge, where the streets curved in elegant symmetry and the mailboxes were uniform, painted in regulation colors, positioned at the exact height mandated in the community agreement booklet, that came unsolicited with his first welcome letter. His property, slightly larger than the others and tucked into a bend where 2 streets met, had once belonged to a regional fire station. The station had been torn down, but the underground wiring, the independent utility hookups, and a series of deep-ground energy conduits had remained, quiet artifacts of a more functional past. Julian, by trade, was not an inventor, a retired colonel, or a rogue electrical engineer. He wasn't an eccentric or a doomsday prepper. In fact, before moving here, he'd worked in logistics for a private aerospace contractor. Most of his job had involved routing shipments, managing error reports, and occasionally negotiating service contracts with county departments. It was there, during an unusually hot summer when California's grid began to flicker under the strain of demand, that he had become deeply familiar with emergency power logistics. He wasn't fascinated by the tech itself. He was more interested in what happened when the systems that people relied on without question suddenly failed. People became vulnerable. Entire neighborhoods darkened. Medical supply depots lost refrigeration. Assisted living facilities ran out of battery backups in a matter of hours. It was a pattern, and once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. So when Julian had moved into the house, formerly the command outpost for the fire station, he saw more than a home. He saw potential. Not just for security, but for contribution. The property had a dual grid access port, a backup transformer, even a shaded enclosure that once housed a generator hookup. Most homeowners would have paved it over or turned it into a shed. Julian filed a formal request with the county, submitted an application for participation in the Emergency Utility Contingency Act, and, after 9 months of verification, interviews, and inspections, he was certified as a licensed backup energy contributor. It wasn't glamorous, he wasn't paid a salary, but when storms hit or wildfires rolled in and power lines went down, Julian's generator automatically kicked on, not just for his home, but for a short list of county-designated sites. The reach wasn't wide. A small municipal refrigeration unit housing emergency vaccines, a medical alert station at the base of the hill, 3 streetlights at a major neighborhood intersection to ensure visibility for ambulances, and a repeater node used by the fire department for coordination during natural disasters. All of it was invisible to the neighbors. They didn't know that when the lights flickered on during the last outage, it was because of a buried line running through Julian's transformer. He didn't advertise it. The arrangement with the county was simple: stay under the radar, maintain compliance, and ensure that his generator operated within approved decibel levels and fuel efficiency standards. He had done everything by the book. All permits were filed. The enclosure was soundproofed. Regular diagnostics were uploaded monthly to the county's Emergency Services Division. And, for years, the system worked without incident. The power would blink out during heavy storms or heat waves, and in a matter of seconds the whir of his generator would rise, low and steady, tucked into the background hum of wind and rain. Julian had once stood at his window during a thunderstorm and watched the block darken like a collapsing wave, only for his street's corner lights to flicker back to life 30 seconds later. He didn't need applause. The satisfaction came from knowing that, in that moment, someone might have seen where to turn. A paramedic might have found their way. A piece of refrigerated medication might have stayed viable just long enough to save someone. That was enough. But neighborhoods, especially affluent ones like Winslow Ridge, had strange ways of rewarding silence and punishing deviation. The first complaint was delivered not by mail, but slipped under his door in a hand-addressed envelope. It wasn't signed. It didn't mention the generator directly. just a concern about strange vibrations near the south-facing fence, and a request to ensure compliance with neighborhood mechanical disturbance guidelines. Julian read it twice, then placed it in a drawer. He didn't think much of it at the time. A few weeks later came another, a more formal notice this time, printed on paper bearing the logo of the residential committee. This one referred explicitly to unverified mechanical equipment and asked for an inspection. Julian responded by providing documentation of his county certification and the service logs from the last 90 days. He even attached a noise impact report showing the generator's operational volume was below standard levels. He heard nothing back. The silence, he would later realize, was never a good sign. The event that changed everything was so ordinary, so mundane, it almost passed unnoticed. On a Friday evening, a summer storm rolled in. Power lines snapped under the weight of wind and branches. Streetlights died. The medical alert tower went offline. Julian's system engaged exactly as it was meant to, but by the time morning came, something was off. His system console, usually glowing a soft green from the control panel in his garage, was dark. The generator hadn't just powered down, it had been disengaged. Locked. A physical lock, thick and industrial, had been looped through the access handle of the housing unit. Nearby, a placard hung from twine, flapping slightly in the wind. It read, "Property modification under review. Active use temporarily suspended by Community Maintenance Authority." There was no warning, no call, no email, no summons or ticket, and worse, no one took credit. Julian stood in the driveway staring at the sign like it was written in code. His first instinct was to call the county, but it was the weekend. The emergency line transferred him to a call center that only handled outage reports, not infrastructural interference. He sent an email to his liaison at the emergency management office but knew not to expect a reply until Monday. The generator, meanwhile, was dormant. Not broken, not damaged, simply disengaged. It was like someone had walked in, made a decision without permission, and walked away, assuming nothing would happen. And if that were true, if someone had that level of access or arrogance, it meant this was not about safety, but control. That night, Julian slept lightly. Every noise outside made him sit up. Around midnight, a motion sensor tripped at the front gate. By the time he checked the camera feed, it had stopped recording. The logs were blank. Erased or disabled, he didn't know which was worse. He sat at the edge of his bed, not with paranoia, but with an emerging clarity. This wasn't random. It wasn't bureaucratic. Someone had flipped the switch on his ability to serve the community in a time of need, and they'd done it through quiet channels, through silence, through implication and paperwork. That was how they always started, whoever they were. He opened his filing cabinet, pulled out the original generator certification, then the service logs, noise tests, permits, fuel usage receipts, and lastly, the original contract from the county, with the seal embossed faintly at the bottom. He lined them up on the kitchen table, page after page of the paper that said, "I did it right. I followed the rules. I helped." And still someone came and shut it all down without a word. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the first move, and whoever played it wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Monday morning brought more than the usual clutter of spam emails and calendar reminders. Julian's phone lit up with a message from the County Emergency Management Services Department. System deactivation request confirmed. Account termination scheduled for review. Contact support within 48 hours if this is an error. He stared at the message for a long moment, brows furrowed, heart starting to sink with the slow, controlled rhythm of someone who'd seen disaster not explode in a single moment, but unfold in the quiet paper cuts of bureaucracy. He had not filed a deactivation request. He had not terminated anything. His backup energy supply registration had no expiration date unless voluntarily revoked or if gross negligence was found. And he had a flawless record. Still holding the phone, Julian walked into the garage past the shelves of labeled tools and spare cables to where the generator sat in its custom housing, silent, inert, and now visibly padlocked shut with a mechanism he didn't recognize. The lock wasn't something available at local hardware stores. It was thick, powder-coated, probably electronically registered, and etched on the side was a small stamped code, 42BR. It meant nothing to him, but it looked official. Too official. That afternoon, he called his liaison at the county. Gina Maldonado, professional and sharp, had always been responsive in the past, but this time her voice held an unusual tension. "Julian," she said almost cautiously, "I'm looking at your file now. The system shows that you submitted a request to withdraw from the backup contributor program last Thursday. It was flagged as voluntary deactivation due to neighborhood zoning conflict." He felt his chest tighten. "Gina," he said, carefully measured, "I didn't submit any such thing. My zoning hasn't changed. There is no conflict. Someone's either made a mistake or—" He hesitated, not wanting to jump to conclusions but unable to ignore the implication. "Or someone submitted something in my name." She was quiet for a few seconds, then her voice dropped lower. "Off the record, Julian. The form didn't come through our public portal. It came through a partnership exchange with the Community Maintenance Review Board." "That's local?" he asked. "Your neighborhood association?" "I'm not a member of it," he replied quickly. "Never signed anything, never opted in." "Well, that's odd," Gina muttered, "because they submitted the withdrawal authorization with what looks like your digital signature attached. It passed through the internal review system automatically." "I didn't sign anything." He could hear the dull sound of her typing in the background. "I believe you," she said finally, "but we're going to need to file a formal discrepancy claim, and you're going to have to provide documentation proving your identity and disputing the signature. I'll escalate it, but I can't override it until that process is completed." It was a subtle but unmistakable shift. The system that had once treated him as an asset was now treating him like a liability, or worse, a non-entity. Someone else had reached into his file, into his agreements, and flipped a switch, and the system had not only accepted it, it had processed it with clinical efficiency. He scanned the kitchen for the folder he kept his printed documents in, heart rate rising with each second. He knew his data was intact, but it was clear now. Someone else had access, and not from the outside. This wasn't hacking. This was administrative poisoning. Paperwork turned into a weapon, and it was being wielded against him without a sound, without a warning, and, most disturbingly, without any sign of who was behind it. Later that evening, as Julian stepped outside to take in the last light of the day, he saw her again. Karen. Her real name was Clarissa Mayfield, but everyone in the neighborhood called her Karen, though never to her face. A large woman with an overconfident gait, she walked her tiny dog with an exaggerated swing of her hips and a gaze that never missed a detail. She had appointed herself the self-proclaimed gatekeeper of neighborhood decorum. Her house, 2 doors down, sported not 1 but 3 flags: American, state, and the neighborhood's own banner, which she had hand-stitched during a Community Pride Day no one remembered asking for. She waved at Julian, the gesture wide and artificial. "Evening, Mr. Barrett. Hope your little noise box is finally getting sorted. I heard it's off the grid now. About time someone put a stop to that nonsense. We need uniformity, don't you think?" He didn't respond, didn't take the bait. He stared at her for a moment too long, then turned and walked back inside. It clicked for him the next morning when he received a print letter in his mailbox. Not official mail, but printed on home stationery and signed with a curlicue flourish. It read, "Dear neighbor, as an advocate for peace and uniform compliance, I have formally submitted concerns about your generator's disruptive presence. I've been informed that appropriate action has been taken. Let's move forward together toward a quieter, safer, and more compliant Winslow Ridge. There was no logo, no stamp, no reference number, but the intent was clear. Karen had done this, not alone, surely, but as a catalyst, a loudmouth with enough bravado to put something in motion. She wasn't smart enough to falsify a digital authorization or reroute Julian's energy credentials, but she didn't need to be. She'd planted the complaint, rallied enough fearful or indifferent neighbors, and handed the matter off to someone more connected, someone who did have access, and Julian suspected they'd been waiting for an excuse. By midweek, strange things began happening. A landscaping crew he hadn't hired showed up to trim back a hedge that bordered the sidewalk, claiming community visual compliance. The same day, a city truck arrived to inspect his storm drain connection, despite no record of such an inspection. Order in the county's system. His recycling bin was tagged with a yellow warning label. Misplaced content. Review required. He hadn't placed anything in it except cardboard and paper, as usual, and then there were the emails. Not spam, but sudden subscription confirmations from local newsletters and government information portals, all in his name, none of which he had requested. It wasn't an attack in the conventional sense. It was administrative attrition, a flood of microaggressions designed to drown him in missteps and red tape. He made another call to the county. Gina told him she'd push the discrepancy report higher up, but until the issue was resolved, the generator had to remain deactivated or risk violating Municipal Code 7.2.1 regarding unauthorized energy redistribution. Julian hung up the phone slowly, staring at the wall. The system was treating him as if he were trying to hijack his own grid. And the worst part wasn't just the violation. It was the indifference. No one had asked him if anything was wrong. No one had knocked on his door. They had simply removed his ability to function, labeled him an outlier, and disappeared into the structure of their processes. That night, as the street fell quiet and the porch lights blinked on one by one, Julian didn't turn his on. He sat in the dark by his living room window, watching the corner where the repeater tower used to blink faint red during nighttime outages. It was dead now. No signal, no backup light. And somewhere down the hill, a refrigerated storage room for medical supplies sat at ambient temperature, disconnected, because someone had decided that neighborhood harmony mattered more than functionality. He understood in that moment that this wasn't just a conflict over equipment. It was a referendum on autonomy. And he was no longer being treated like a contributor to his community. He was being treated like a contaminant. The following week marked the shift from passive interference to open maneuvering, and Julian could feel it with the slow, deliberate pressure of something heavy being dragged into motion just beneath the surface of ordinary life. It began with the email from a lawyer. Not his lawyer, not even a lawyer he had ever heard of. The message was formal, brief, and oddly cheerful in tone, as though the writer expected compliance out of politeness alone. It stated that the Community Maintenance Authority, under a newly passed internal resolution, was asserting oversight rights over properties containing infrastructure with potential communal impact. The email included a PDF of the resolution, vague, and full of conditional language citing ambient environmental harmony, mechanical inconsistency with neighborhood aesthetics, and non-standard energy footprint as justifications for this oversight. Buried on page 5 was a line that set Julian's jaw. Effective immediately. The property located at 227 East Vaughan Loop shall be considered under temporary communal review status and subject to gridline reallocation as determined by collective zoning authority. He read it 3 times, each pass bringing with it a colder, sharper clarity. The language was deliberately ambiguous, designed not to state authority outright but to imply it so forcefully that refuting it would seem oppositional. He was being boxed in through implication and soft threats, the kind that wouldn't stand in a courtroom but were powerful enough to paralyze the average homeowner. He didn't reply to the email. Instead, he printed it, filed it with his other documentation, and made a note to forward it to Gina at the county. Then he called his attorney. Julian's legal counsel, a steady, gray-templed man named Barrett Lowe, had been his quiet professional companion for a decade. Mostly tax filings and small contractual issues, but Barrett was precise, slow to speak, and skilled at reading between the lines. After Julian explained what was happening and forwarded the email, Barrett paused. "They're not coming after you directly," he said finally. "They're trying to recategorize your property as something it's not. It's not a lawsuit. It's pretext." Julian leaned against the kitchen counter, phone wedged between his ear and shoulder. "Pretext for what?" Barrett didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice dropped half a pitch. "Control. They want control of your grid link. If they can make the generator part of a communal network, they can dictate its use, or prevent it altogether. They don't care about the noise. They care about the node." That word stuck with Julian long after the call ended. Node. As if his home had ceased being a residence and become a gear in someone else's system. That evening, a large white pickup with a corporate logo parked near the end of the street. 3 men in khaki uniforms and orange safety vests got out and walked the perimeter of his fence, carrying clipboards and occasionally tapping on tablets. When Julian stepped outside and asked them what they were doing, the one in front offered a vague smile. "Just here to confirm some utility junctions for the neighborhood zoning update." Julian asked for identification. The man lifted his badge for half a second, but it wasn't from the city. It was a third-party contracting firm. Julian didn't argue. He walked back inside, retrieved his phone, and started recording discreetly from the window. The men didn't approach the house. They took photos of the side gate, the conduit box, and the transformer enclosure behind the garage. Then they left. The next morning, a new notice appeared on his front gate, laminated, zip-tied to the iron slats, official only in tone but not in substance. "Pending review, do not tamper." Below that, a printed message in small text, "Access to electrical housing restricted per community safety protocol. Do not attempt to activate or bypass sealed units. Legal review in progress." There was no signature. No reference to a city ordinance, just a warning, daring him to challenge it. Julian removed the sign and took photos. He posted nothing online. No angry rants, no social media exposés. Instead, he collected it all, building a quiet archive of the subtle war being waged across paper, email, and asphalt. The real break came that Friday, when Gina called him, not emailed but called, her voice unusually tight. "Julian, I need to ask, off the record, have you been approached by anyone offering to buy your property?" He blinked at the question. "No. Why?" There was a pause on the line. "Because your county registration has been flagged as under reevaluation due to projected real estate repurposement. That only happens when there's interest from a municipal acquisition group or an entity applying for local redevelopment grants. Your address is showing up in a different category now, infrastructure-sensitive zoning." Julian straightened. "Someone's trying to reposition my property for acquisition." "That's what it looks like," she said, "but nothing's official. It's all still in the suggestion phase, quiet, intentional. Someone is prepping the system like you're going to sell, even if you don't know it." He thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence for a long time. Then, methodically, he stood, pulled open the cabinet beneath the stairs, and retrieved the hard copy folder containing every correspondence he'd received since the shutdown. Letters, emails, the unsigned community notes, even the inspection photos he'd taken. He organized them by date, numbered them, and placed a cover sheet on top. "Undocumented community interference. 227 E. Vaughn Loop." He scanned the whole folder, saved it to 3 drives, and placed one in his fireproof safe. The next day, he drove to the city records office and requested a full property history printout, zoning map, and recent permit filings within a 1-mile radius. While he waited, he overheard a clerk at another window telling someone about proactive grant filings for district optimization. The phrase meant nothing to the average listener. To Julian, it was another breadcrumb. By Sunday, the mood on the street had shifted again. Where before there was tension, now there was activity. Karen had put up new signage on her lawn. Proud supporter of Winslow Ridge Clean Power Future. Across the street, a pair of men Julian didn't recognize were painting something on the curb. Colored markers, one blue, one yellow, forming a box just in front of his driveway. He asked them what they were doing, and they replied, "Drainage code compliance. Nothing major." But they didn't have city uniforms, and the paint was weather-resistant. Permanent. Julian took photos again. The pattern was clear now. They weren't just inconveniencing him. They were redefining the terrain around him. His property was being quietly mapped, labeled, and converted. Late that night, Julian walked the perimeter of his lot, flashlight in hand. He paused by the generator enclosure, still locked by an external seal he didn't install. He crouched, examined the lock more carefully, and noticed a QR sticker, barely visible under the lip of the housing. It wasn't commercial. It linked, when scanned, to a portal for a private energy firm called Nova Terra Cooperative. He had never heard of them. A search revealed nothing official, no local contracts, no public records, just a placeholder website with a slogan, "Powering Tomorrow's Neighborhoods Today." That was the moment he knew this wasn't just about aesthetics or noise or property compliance. Someone, multiple someones, had begun the process of converting his property into a gateway node for a broader energy plan. And the only thing stopping them had been his generator and his refusal to be absorbed. He returned inside and placed the QR scan report in his growing evidence folder. Then he opened a blank document and began to write. Not a complaint, not a rant. A formal inquiry addressed to the County Inspector General's office, requesting a review of unauthorized utility modifications and undeclared development coordination between non-governmental energy contractors and residential administrative bodies. He cited statutes, he quoted inspection standards, and he included everything he had collected. When he hit send, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt prepared. Not because he knew what was coming, but because now, at least, someone else had been forced to look. The week following his formal inquiry unfolded not with sirens or subpoenas, but with the steady, almost imperceptible push of something massive realigning its weight. Julian didn't receive a response from the Inspector General's office right away, nor did he expect one. Government oversight moved in layers, especially when tangled in hybrid zones of residential governance and semi-private infrastructure. But there were signs, subtle procedural footprints that indicated his submission had not been ignored. The county's digital services portal, where he maintained his contractor credentials, now showed his generator profile as under conditional hold, rather than terminated. The language had changed, and with it, so had the tone. It wasn't much, but in administrative language, a reclassification was the equivalent of someone cracking a door open and peeking inside. Julian knew better than to celebrate. Instead, he prepared. He updated his logs, downloaded time-stamped copies of all previous diagnostic reports, and secured a notarized statement from the original county engineer who had overseen the inspection of his generator 2 years prior. The man, retired but sharp, remembered the installation clearly and agreed to submit a formal affidavit verifying the legitimacy of Julian's setup, down to the serial number of the grounding frame and the decibel output measurements. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a reliable witness. Something systems couldn't easily erase or rewrite. 2 days later, the neighborhood entered what Karen cheerfully referred to on the block's unofficial Facebook page as Phase 1 of our greener future. Julian wasn't on the page, but a neighbor forwarded the post with a single line. "You're going to want to see this?" It featured a photo of Karen, flanked by two men in branded polos from Nova Terra Cooperative, standing beside a table covered with pamphlets and what looked like a blueprint of the subdivision. Behind them was a pop-up banner that read, "Winslow Ridge Pilot Community, Private Clean Grid Beta Zone." Julian stared at the image for a long time. He wasn't surprised anymore. What struck him was how far along they were. This wasn't a test. It was a quiet launch. That same evening, he received a call, not from the county but from a soft-spoken man who introduced himself only as Glenn, a representative from a regional oversight task force connected to municipal infrastructure coordination. Glenn's tone was careful, professional, but not sterile. He told Julian that his complaint had triggered a review, and that while the county's involvement was still unfolding, there were inconsistencies in how Nova Terra had registered their pilot program. Glenn didn't go into details, but he asked Julian to make a full copy of his logs available for inspection and, if possible, refrain from tampering with the generator housing while an audit was pending. Julian agreed, though the irony was not lost on him. He wasn't allowed to touch the machine he was once trusted to operate in service of public safety. After the call ended, Julian sat for a long time at the kitchen table, his notes spread out before him like a war map. He wasn't an investigator. He wasn't a crusader, but he could follow cause and effect, and by now the pattern was undeniable. Someone, somewhere, had seen his property not as a problem to be solved, but as a resource to be acquired. The groundwork for that acquisition had been bureaucratic, changing language, sowing ambiguity, mislabeling access rights, but behind the curtain was a very real shift in control, one being orchestrated by a company that had not yet earned the authority they were already exercising. Later that week, a box arrived at his doorstep, unmarked, unrequested. Inside was a binder filled with material from Nova Terra. Their branding was slick, modern, and coded in the type of language Julian had learned to distrust in his aerospace years. Modular synergy, neighborhood empowerment, distributed resilience architecture. Glossy maps depicted Winslow Ridge as a shining example of clean integration. But there was no mention of the county's emergency services network, no inclusion of his generator, no acknowledgement of the repeater tower, or the refrigeration unit down the hill. It was as though he, and the infrastructure he supported, had never existed. That omission told him everything. Julian decided to attend the upcoming community briefing, scheduled for Saturday morning at the local charter school gymnasium. He didn't bring documents or prepare a speech. He went to listen. When he arrived, the gym was decked out in Nova Terra banners. Karen stood near the entrance wearing a name badge that identified her as Community Liaison, handing out brochures and complimenting people on their energy literacy. Inside, Julian took a seat near the back and watched. A man in a fitted sport coat led the presentation, guiding attendees through slides full of graphs and projections about reduced costs, lower emissions, and energy democracy. People clapped. Questions were softball. Someone asked if there would be incentives for participation. The speaker smiled. Absolutely. Early adopters may receive rebates, priority grid access, and municipal tax breaks. When Julian raised his hand, the speaker's smile didn't waver. He acknowledged him, but cautiously. Julian kept his tone even. Can you clarify whether Nova Terra's project has been formally authorized by the county, or if it's still under provisional designation pending audit review? The room quieted. The speaker tilted his head slightly. I'm not at liberty to comment on the status of interagency reviews. However, I can assure you that Nova Terra operates with full transparency and in cooperation with local leadership. Julian nodded once, then asked his second question. Is your infrastructure legally recognized as a primary or auxiliary provider for emergency services during outages? The man hesitated. We're primarily focused on civilian consumption and community-level stabilization. So, Julian said, his voice carrying further than intended, you're not a designated emergency provider, and you're actively replacing infrastructure that was. There were murmurs. The speaker moved on quickly, pivoting to a question about smart meters. After the meeting, Julian left without speaking to anyone. He had said enough. That night, someone dumped a bag of trash across his driveway. Not an accident. Deliberate. Eggs. Rotted vegetables. The stench was sharp. He didn't clean it immediately. He photographed it, documented the time, logged the security footage. Then, at 2:13 a.m., the generator's external sensor pinged an attempted access override. Julian didn't respond in person. He uploaded the alert to a backup system and flagged it for Glenn. A boundary had been crossed, and whether they knew it or not, whoever did it had just handed him proof of malicious intent. He wasn't at war with neighbors anymore. He was in the middle of a territorial conversion dressed in smiling banners and environmental slogans. And they hadn't expected resistance. They expected silence. They expected compliance. But Julian was done complying. The line had been drawn. Now he just had to decide what came next. The Monday after the community meeting began with a dull mechanical hum outside Julian's window. A sound too steady to be incidental and too precise to be residential. He pulled back the curtain and saw them. 3 utility vans parked in a row, orange cones laid out across the street, and a group of men unloading equipment next to the curb adjacent to his driveway. They weren't city workers. Their uniforms bore the Novaterra logo, but this time they weren't just canvassing or inspecting. They were digging. One of them stood over a junction box near Julian's property line, crowbar in hand, while another checked readings on a handheld monitor connected to a tablet. No one rang his bell. No one issued notice, and, most tellingly, no one looked at him. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, arms crossed, eyes locked on the man closest to the sidewalk. "What's the scope of work here?" Julian asked, his voice level. One of the men turned, clearly not expecting to be confronted. He hesitated before replying. "Upgrades to support the new microgrid framework. We've got clearance to optimize ground routing for shared utilities." Julian raised an eyebrow. "That transformer runs directly to my property's emergency conduit. It's not shared. It's registered county equipment." The man blinked, checked his screen again, and shrugged. "We're just following the plan, sir. This is all coordinated with the Community Infrastructure Board." Julian didn't respond. He walked down the path slowly, stepped around the cone, and took out his phone. He snapped photos, wide shots, close-ups, their equipment, their faces. The man didn't stop him, but his jaw tensed. Julian spoke again, this time not as a question, but a warning. "If any of this affects the backup system I'm licensed to operate, it will be classified as obstruction of critical infrastructure." The man said nothing. Within minutes, they packed up and left, not in a rush, but not at ease either. That afternoon, Julian called Glenn. He explained what had happened in clipped detail and followed with the photos. Glenn's response was calm but unmistakably concerned. "They're trying to trigger a jurisdictional collapse," he said. "If they can physically alter the infrastructure before legal lines are drawn, they can claim it's part of a new system and file for retroactive zoning coverage." Julian leaned against the kitchen counter, tension in his chest like coiled wire. "And if I interfere?" Glenn exhaled. "Then they'll claim you're the one obstructing progress. They'll paint you as a rogue element, non-compliant, maybe even hostile." Julian didn't ask the next question out loud. How do you fight people who already think you're the problem for refusing to be absorbed? That night, it escalated. Again. At exactly 1:37 a.m., his motion alert system triggered a perimeter breach at the rear fence. The sensor sent a silent ping to his private relay, and within seconds he was up, dressed and outside with a flashlight in one hand and a legal taser in the other. He didn't expect to find anything, and he didn't. Whoever it was had already gone, but what they left behind told him everything. The latch on the generator enclosure had been tampered with. Not broken, manipulated. The seal was still in place, but beneath it, Julian found a thin, fiber-optic thread running into the base of the housing, barely visible, like a surgical implant, routed through the grass and disappearing into the soil. He followed the thread until it vanished beneath the paving near the sidewalk. He didn't touch it further. Instead, he documented it, close-up video, time-stamped logs, infrared imaging from the garage cam. He saved everything, uploaded copies to 3 encrypted locations, and sent the entire bundle to Glenn with a single message. They've hardwired an unauthorized sensor into the enclosure. Data siphon, or trigger, Glenn replied minutes later. Not clear, but that's no longer a civil matter. That's a digital breach of a protected system. Julian stared at the screen, heart beating a slow, measured rhythm. This wasn't about complaints anymore. This was tactical. Someone had crossed the line from property manipulation into strategic sabotage. The next day, 2 city compliance officers appeared at his doorstep. They weren't the usual clipboard drones. They were composed, professional, and clearly uncomfortable. One introduced herself as Officer Morales, the other as Inspector Day. They said they were here to investigate an escalated series of reports regarding non-compliant use of restricted systems. Julian didn't let them finish before handing them a copy of his county registration, a notarized affidavit from the engineer, the most recent logs, and 3 official county emails verifying his license and function. They took the documents without comment. Day asked if they could inspect the generator. Julian nodded, but led them directly to the housing and pointed to the fiber-optic thread. Morales crouched beside it, eyes narrowing. "Did you install this?" "No," Julian replied. "I found it last night. It was inserted through the soil after hours." She didn't say anything, but her expression changed. Day made a note, asked 3 routine questions, then thanked him. "We'll be filing a supplementary report to the Public Works Division. You'll receive a copy within 5 business days." They left, and Julian knew exactly what had just happened. Not only had they seen it, they had documented it. And that made it real, tangible, admissible. For the first time since the shutdown, he felt the ground shift in his direction. But Novaterra wasn't finished. Within 48 hours, Julian's property was cited for 3 separate violations. One was for improper material disposal, referencing a coil of insulated wire in his open garage. Another was for unauthorized signage, because he had posted a laminated copy of his county credentials on the inside of his fence. The third was the most absurd. Environmental interference, unregulated light output due to the placement of his security floodlight, which apparently violated updated lumen standards for community tranquility. He laughed when he read that one. It wasn't funny. It was tactical pressure. Create inconvenience, surround the target with noise, force a reaction. Julian didn't react. He responded, formally. He filed counter-reports, each supported with photos, timestamps, and references to municipal code. He hand-delivered them to the city clerk's office and requested stamped copies. Then, as a final step, he called the county's legal advisory service for licensed infrastructure contractors and requested a protective injunction. Temporary, limited scope, but enough to prevent further physical alterations to his generator housing, while the investigation remained open. It wasn't immediate. It would take days. But it was a lever, and Julianne knew how to wait. That weekend, Karen made her next move. She hosted a town hall on future readiness at the cul-de-sac, complete with a catered buffet and a rented podium. She invited a local blogger, known for cheerleading public-private projects, and paraded Novaterra's representatives around like visiting royalty. Julian watched from his porch. When the blogger passed by, she stared at him for a moment, then looked away. A sign of progress. The story was shifting. And then came the call Julian had not expected. It was from an internal audit investigator from the State Department of Infrastructure Ethics. His name was Marcus, and he didn't waste time. "We've received materials," he said, "not just from your reports. Other complaints, indirect, fragments. But it's enough. I need to ask. Are you willing to provide a deposition if this develops into a formal case?" Julian answered without hesitation. "Yes." "Good," Marcus said, "because based on what we're seeing, this might go well beyond local interference. Someone setting up real estate for a state-level energy privatization rollout without proper notice or jurisdiction. If your node gets absorbed, others will follow. Your system was never the threat. It was the obstacle." Julian said nothing for a long time after the call ended. He stood in the quiet of his home, the hum of electricity barely audible behind the walls, his backup system still dormant, still sealed, still intact. For now, but now, he understood. He wasn't a homeowner in conflict with a committee. He was a keystone in a larger plan. And every step taken against him was just the beginning of a blueprint being etched quietly into every cul-de-sac in the state. He wasn't afraid. He was awake. It was the early hours of Thursday when Julian's phone vibrated silently on his nightstand, pulling him out of a light, fragmented sleep. The notification wasn't from his security system this time. It was from the county's legal counsel office. The injunction he had filed a week earlier had been granted. Temporary, conditional, but effective immediately. It barred Nova Terra or any of its affiliated contractors from conducting any modifications, installations, or infrastructure tie-ins within 30 feet of his registered emergency system, pending full review by the Oversight Board. The message came with a formal notice PDF and a seal that meant it had passed judicial review. It was the first real blow struck on his behalf, not by negotiation or confrontation, but by law. He printed 3 copies of the injunction, laminated one, and affixed it directly to the enclosure gate. The other 2 he kept, one on his porch window, one in his vehicle. Then he made coffee. Strong, black, no sugar. The adrenaline of resolution hadn't arrived yet. There was no victory here, only positioning. But it was positioning with teeth. That morning, he watched from the porch as the Novaterra maintenance vehicle that had become a familiar eyesore turned the corner and paused briefly by his curb. The driver stared at the sign, squinted, and then slowly drove off. No engine idling, no clipboard. Just silence. By noon, Glenn called. "You've opened a door, Julian." Novaterra's legal team filed an objection within 2 hours of the injunction being issued, but the panel held firm. They're rattled. Julian's tone remained flat. "They should be." Glenn hesitated before adding, "There's movement now. We're seeing redirection of contracts and digital erasure of asset identifiers on their internal systems. They're sanitizing. Fast." Julian didn't need a translation. It meant the corporate side of the operation understood they'd been caught operating in murky water and were trying to retract their claws without leaving scratches that would lead back to them. That didn't make them harmless. It made them cornered. And Julian knew the most dangerous players weren't the loud ones. They were the ones who stopped speaking altogether. 2 days later, an envelope was slipped under his door in the middle of the night. No return address. Inside, a printed screenshot from an internal Novaterra dashboard showing his name, his address, and a label beside it. Non-integrated node, critical conversion priority. The printout was grainy but real. Taped to the back was a sticky note, handwritten in rushed, all-caps block letters, "Don't trust local handlers. They're not running the show." No signature. Julian stood in his hallway, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house, and stared at the words for a long time. Someone inside the system had passed him a lifeline, or maybe a warning. Probably both. That same afternoon, the quiet snapped. A city notice was posted on his mailbox. Public hearing scheduled. Zoning compliance review of residential use grid structures. The hearing was set for Monday morning. No further details. Julian called Barrett, his lawyer. Barrett sighed on the other end of the line. They're accelerating the pressure. They want to box you in publicly so you'll fold privately. The hearing is just a tool. What's the play? Julian asked. Barrett's voice was calm but clipped. You show up. You show everything. You don't argue. You let their contradictions do the talking. Julian nodded. Understood. Monday came gray and windless. The hearing was held at the administrative annex 2 districts over, in a windowless hall that smelled faintly of printer ink and disinfectant. Julian arrived early. Barrett was already there, briefcase in hand, every document chronologically filed and indexed. Inside the hearing room, a panel of 3 zoning board members sat in chairs that seemed deliberately too high, their voices neutral, their expressions unreadable. On the other side sat 2 Nova Terra representatives, neither of whom had appeared at prior community events. One was a woman in a dark blazer who never made eye contact. The other was a man who spoke with the inflectionless cadence of someone trained not to answer questions, only to repeat policies. The hearing began with procedural statements, acknowledgments of jurisdiction, and the reading of the injunction. Then Julian was asked to present. He didn't speak emotionally. He didn't appeal to fairness. He presented his license, the emergency network registration, the logged interference attempts, the unauthorized fiber tap, the shifting zoning codes, and, finally, the anonymous dashboard printout. Barrett did the heavy lifting, explaining how the digital reclassification of Julian's infrastructure violated both the state's Infrastructure Protection Statute and a clause in the Energy Safety Compliance Act that specifically barred non-governmental entities from rerouting public safety nodes without state oversight. When they finished, the room was still. Then the Nova Terra side took the floor. The woman from corporate didn't deny the fiber tap. She called it a legacy signal relay diagnostic, saying it was part of early integration testing and had been deactivated prior to discovery. When asked about Julian's registration, she described it as non-standard legacy provisioning, implying it was no longer compatible with current communal optimization goals. When pressed on whether they had received explicit authorization from county services to overwrite or deactivate that node, the man stepped in and said, "As we understand it, the community's evolving energy framework prioritizes collective synchronization over individual exceptions." He smiled when he said it, but Julian saw the crack at the corner of his mouth. He was sweating. When the panel dismissed them, they didn't issue a ruling. They said they would reconvene after an internal session and issue a finding within 5 days. Julian left the room with Barrett in silence. Outside, a breeze had finally picked up. The weight in Julian's chest didn't lift, but it realigned. Something had changed. Nova Terra had shown their real face in a room where it had to be recorded. That couldn't be undone. 2 mornings later, Karen knocked on his door. She didn't shout. She didn't bring flyers or threats or noise complaints. She stood, arms folded, jaw set, and said nothing for the first few seconds. Julian didn't offer pleasantries. "What do you want?" he asked. Her voice was quieter than he'd ever heard it. "You've made things difficult." "Good," he replied. She blinked like she hadn't expected that. "They're going to go around you," she said. "If they can't use you, they'll isolate you. Buy the lots next door, build a ring. You'll be the last light in the dark." He said nothing. "You can't stop it," she added. He tilted his head. "No," he said, "but I can force them to admit what they're doing, where everyone can see it." She left without another word. And as Julian watched her walk down the street, back toward her house with the banners and the flags and the illusion of leadership, He didn't feel victorious. He felt prepared. Prepared for the moment when the mask fully dropped and everyone else saw what he already knew. This wasn't about energy. It wasn't about zoning or compliance or noise. It was about control. And he had just broken their grip, if only long enough to show others where to look. The decision came on a Thursday morning without ceremony. An envelope from the zoning board had been slipped through Julian's mail slot, marked with a formal crest and sealed in heavyweight paper. Inside was a single-page ruling. The board had found Nova Terra's encroachment unjustified, its integration efforts premature, and its failure to obtain state-level authorization for infrastructure modification grounds for immediate injunction. Extension. Julian's generator was cleared for full operational reactivation. No conditions, no time limits. The hearing transcripts would be forwarded to the Office of Municipal Oversight for further review, and the public records would reflect the enforcement violation logged against the Community Maintenance Authority for allowing unauthorized corporate access to registered emergency systems. The language wasn't emotional. It didn't celebrate him. It didn't condemn them. It simply stated what was now true. They had overreached, and the law had caught up. Julian didn't cheer. He didn't call anyone. He made a copy of the letter, folded it into his file, and went to the garage. He removed the remaining seals from the generator housing with gloved hands, then opened the enclosure and ran a full system diagnostic. Everything checked out. No corruption. No signs of backdoor activation. Just a dormant, compliant system waiting to serve. He restarted the generator at 2:47 p.m. with a manual bypass and watched as the soft hum returned to the machine, the power indicator glowing green against the silver casing. It was not triumphant. It was functional. And it was his again. News didn't spread fast. There were no fireworks. The street remained quiet. But within a week, the silence began to change shape. One by one, the Nova Terra-marked street placards were quietly removed, not by crews, but by someone anonymous during the night. The vans stopped showing up. A neighbor who had once nodded politely but said nothing crossed the street one evening and offered Julian a beer without explanation. Another left a note in his mailbox. "You didn't fold. Thanks for not folding." They weren't alliances. They were acknowledgments, subtle, tentative, but real. Winslow Ridge had seen the seams in its surface, and while most still preferred to live within the illusion of order, they could no longer pretend not to know where the cracks were. Karen's banners disappeared from her lawn. The liaison title vanished from her online profiles. At the next voluntary block meeting, one Julian did not attend, she reportedly said nothing for the entire hour, sitting quietly at the edge of the circle while others discussed seasonal decorations and garbage pickup schedules. When she passed Julian on the sidewalk days later, she offered no smirk, no comment, only the briefest glance that landed and vanished like the flutter of a curtain in wind. It wasn't defeat, it was recognition. But not everything faded so easily. 2 weeks after reactivation, Julian received an unmarked package. Inside was a USB drive and nothing else. He didn't plug it in. He took it directly to Glenn, who passed it through digital forensics. The contents, it turned out, were fragment logs, raw back-end data from Nova Terra's infrastructure simulations, including references to several other neighborhoods flagged for decentralized override node absorption. His home hadn't been the only one. He'd been a pilot test, a first run, and because he'd pushed back, the network had been forced to reveal itself early. Julian asked Glenn if the data would be investigated. Glenn nodded. "It's going above our heads now. Energy procurement boards, possibly even state legislature oversight. You turned a case into a report, and that report's going to leave a mark." Julian didn't feel like a whistleblower. He wasn't angry anymore, just aware of how easily systems could wrap themselves around you with smiles and grants and procedural ambiguity, and how critical it was to recognize when compliance became surrender. He didn't join any new movements. He didn't file lawsuits or go on speaking circuits. He simply made upgrades, secured the system tighter, segmented its access points, encrypted the relays with a new protocol that only he controlled. He reviewed his emergency contacts, retested his failovers, and filed an update with the county quietly, as he had always done. Functional, professional, anonymous. The neighborhood eventually settled. Kids returned to skateboarding past his driveway without hesitation. The corner lights, powered again by his backup node, resumed their steady glow during storms. The repeater tower flickered back into life, quietly flashing red on foggy nights. Life resumed its rhythm. Not because of Julian, but because he had ensured the mechanisms beneath it remained intact. He didn't want credit. He just didn't want to be erased. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, months later, Julian sat on his porch with a coffee and listened to the hum of the generator as it cycled into a passive maintenance mode. Somewhere down the hill, the medical cold storage unit would be pulsing with steady power. Somewhere across the intersection, someone might still think the lights just stayed on because that's how it's always been. He was fine with that. Let them think so. As long as it worked. As long as it stayed his to protect. And that was enough.